Just a little bit about what I do, because that's the context out of which I'm going to speak. I hold a doctorate in education from Boston College, but I'm not an educational researcher. I'm an educational practitioner. And currently what I do is twofold, but I really see as one. I serve as the animator for LaSalle Information for all the constituencies of the school. Faculty, staff, students, board, parents, alums. So I oversee that. But on the other hand, I work as the director of the new teacher program, which is a 2-year program. So what I'm trying to say to people in my school is that LaSalle Information and professional development in a mission-driven school is one and the same thing. That when we become a better teacher, we become a better LaSallian. And when we become a better LaSallian, we become a better teacher. So there's a certain unity, because at least here in the United States, when we say LaSalle Information, we think spirituality, prayer, which drives some people off. But that's not the fact. Right? LaSalle Information in a mission-driven institution is one and the same with developing oneself as a professional. Tremendously grateful to, and I'm glad I stayed here since Sunday night, to Dr. Ospino, because the other thing that I've done over the past couple of years is to lead the initiative for diversity in the school, and to do focus groups with students to eventually begin a diversity group of black, white, Hispanic, Asian, male, female, all the different years of the school. And then last year to convene an all-school diversity group of administration, faculty, staff, students, and parents to look at the macro issues of diversity within the school. So I found his comments engaging, stimulating, challenging, at the same time affirming in terms of what we should be doing. This morning, Brother Ernest asked me if I would provide a little LaSallian context for what we've been looking at over the past few days, and to do it in terms of these sort of educational keywords, vision and praxis, which is really theory and doing. You know, what's the idea behind the LaSallian educational pedagogy, and what is the practice of the LaSallian pedagogy? And to look at it in terms of text and context. I'd like to begin, though, by just recalling that we're in God's holy presence. Now, this beautiful fall day to sing the praises of the Lord through the words of E.E. Cummings. I thank you, Lord, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and the blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. I who have died am alive again today, and this is the Son's birthday. This is the birthday of life and of love and of wings and of the gay great happening, illimitably earth. How should tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing any lifted from the know of all nothing, human merely being, doubt unimaginable you? Now the ears of my ears awake, and the eyes of my eyes are opened. Now the ears of my ears awake, and the eyes of my eyes are open. And that's what we've been talking about the past couple of days, right? Hearing the voices of others, seeing from different perspectives. So we pray today that we can continue to allow our ears to be open and our eyes to see clearly. St. John Baptist de La Salle. Live Jesus in our hearts. Okay. I'm going to start where I start in my bottom-up presentation on Sunday night. So Sunday night is a long day of travel, so this will be a great review for my buddy from last summer, Phil, who I had a couple of summers ago, and Mary Ann. But I really think it's a significant way to begin. And I begin all of my Lasallian formation presentations using this same diagram, which is a little faded out, but you have the text there. And it's called the double contemplation. It's a model created by Jared Rummery, who spoke last year. But I think it's a key model for us to think about when we're framing questions of our Lasallian educational vision. So we have John Baptist de La Salle. And we know from the story of John Baptist de La Salle that he was born into wealth, not into nobility, but born into wealth. His father was a magistrate. His mother came from the Moet Champagne family. He lived in inner city Reims. Inner city Reims was nice. It was the gated community at the time. There was the cathedral. There were the convent schools and the wealthy houses and the city government and whatever. And then there were the walls, and then there were the others. Still the way in major cities in Europe, right? So when you hear that there's riots in the suburbs, we say, how could there be riots? No, because the suburbs are where the poor are. So he was brought up in a gated community, and he loved to be with his mother's parents, who would take him into the vineyards, into the country, and as a young child, sit with them and pray. Pray the Psalms and pray the Rosary. And as that young child, his deep spirituality and love for God started to grow. And at an early age, 12, he began the orders with tonsure. And at 16, he was appointed the canon of the cathedral, wealthy position for which he had to go to the cathedral and pray and receive money. And he was well on the way to becoming a bishop, probably. He went to the chief seminary in Paris, studied under the Sulpicians, and under the Sulpicians continued to develop that deep personal spirituality, which was the French spirituality at that time. He has a doctorate in theology, scriptures. Really a scholar of St. Paul. So he reads St. Paul and he sees that, especially in 1 Timothy, God who wants all to be saved. God desires that all human beings come to the fullness of life. All of a sudden, though, De La Salle's parents die over a 6-month period. He's called home from the seminary. He's the oldest in a family of 7 or 8. He's the executor. He has to take care of his younger brothers and sisters. His spiritual director says to him at some point, De La Salle, I'm working with a group of sisters who have a school for poor girls, and there's a layman here who wants some help in starting a school for poor boys, Adrian Yell. Could you go and help him? Because you have contacts, in Reims. So he meets with Adrian Yell. And all of a sudden, he sees the children of the artisans and the poor. He's out of the wall. More and more he gets engaged because Niel is a great innovator, but not very much of a manager. The schools are doing terribly. De La Salle says, I have to take over, helping the teachers to learn. He buys them a house so that he can train. He brings them into his own house. He starts to meet the young kids. And he sees these children of the artisans of the poor who are far from salvation. He sees. What did Hofmann say? The first step is to see. He sees. All of a sudden, he sees. Frightening. He sees a reality he had never seen. And he's face to face with them, and they're in his house. These young men who, in reflection, he says, are lower than my valet. He sees them. He's with them. He's dealing with them face to face. And he sees God who wants all to be saved and young people who are far from salvation. And this salvation for John Baptist de La Salle is that fullness of life which is talked about in John. I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. Right? This is not the Marxian concept of fullness of life after death. This is the opiate of the people. No, John Baptist de La Salle is saying that, yes, we're talking about eternal salvation, but we're talking about eternal salvation that begins in the fullness of life for young people here and now. And these young people have no hope. They have no chance of salvation. And God wants them to be saved. He judges. He makes a judgment. And the judgment unfolds, as Hoffman said today, as Revelation unfolds over time. Not all of a sudden. It wasn't that the lightning bolt struck him when Adrian Niel, because in his reflection later on, John Baptist de La Salle, if I knew then what I know now, I'm not so sure I would have done what I did then. But it unfolded over time. He says, God who gently calls us step by step, who never forces our will, but God who is unfolding for us the plan. And John Baptist de La Salle is led from one commitment to another to finally the realization that God's call to me is to make salvation accessible to all. I make that judgment. I cannot do anything else. Not as the protagonist, though. John Baptist de La Salle never sees himself as the protagonist. God is the protagonist. God has the goodness to remedy this situation. De La Salle sees himself as the instrument, the minister, the one who is willing to do what he judges to be God's will for young people at that time. So therefore, he founds the Christian school as a privileged method. He creates around himself a group of teachers who become the privileged instruments, and that they do this together and by association. This is a wonderful paradigm to keep in mind. This is the story of our lives, too. Right? See, judge, act. See, judge, act is a universal. See, judge, act is what happens here. See, judge, act is what we've been called to over the past couple of days. And however we're seeing, whether we're seeing minority, or we're seeing gay, or we're seeing female, or we're seeing secularist, or whatever we're seeing, all of a sudden, if we really see, there's an impact on us, like on John Baptist de La Salle, so that John Baptist de La Salle never becomes a bishop. In fact, at the end of his life, the local church strips him of his faculties as a priest. Why? Because he was working in a place like this for delinquent boys. And the church rules were, you go to Mass in the parish. So for those kids to go to Mass, he would have to drag the prisoners, the young kids, through the streets so that they would be recognized and seen, there's a bad kid. He said, no, I'm going to say Mass for them where they live. And the local pastor got annoyed. And on his deathbed, they were coming to tell him that he would no longer be able to exercise his ministry as a priest. So radical, right, was the conversion, again, Hospino's word, was the conversion that John Baptist de La Salle went through over time. Over time. That's the same call to us, over time. Okay. Just to use a few things so that we can, I want to play back and forth on what Hoffman said. Let's think about personal identity here. John Baptist's personal identity as wealthy, priest. All of a sudden, in this context, he shifts to brother. He shifts to brother. In the midst of a deep personal midlife crisis, he's away from the brothers. The brothers write to him and say, John Baptist de La Salle, we command you to return to us to lead us. He responds as brother. His identity is shifted. He's no longer power. He's servant. Social location. Just think of social location and what we were just saying, how we have to hop out of our own social location. Here he is in a nice gated community, and all of a sudden, he runs flat out into this horrendous context, which we're going to talk about, and he even breaches the walls by bringing those people into the gated community so that his family ostracizes him and says, get out of our house with these kids, these young people. Social location. And then he lives outside the walls. And then the context. He was able to hop out of his shoes and look at the context of the world around him, which we're going to look at. The context of 17th century France. Well, French society was divided into three classes or estates, right? The nobility, the clergy, and the commoners, the great group. Now, among the commoners would be the nouveau riche, right? The wealthy bourgeoisie, like De La Salle's parents, city officials, owners of estates, not nobility, but with money. Also would be what we would call the middle-class workers, the artisans, the members of the guilds, the crafts, the leather makers, the gold makers, whatever. The poor, those who did not belong to a guild or a craft and had to, harvest in the seasons and serve as mercenary soldiers or whatever. And then the transient poor, the beggars, those who had to move around. So even though we say that there are three classes, there are really multiple classes. And the artisans could quickly slip into the have-nots, right? Depending on weather, economy, conditions, famine, war, all of those things could allow the slippery slope from being a have to a have-not. Think about this, because I'm going to ask you in a few minutes. Think about this in terms of our own context, right? So a society of haves and have-nots. Divide. Young people who are on the streets and are unemployable. If one was poor and without work, then you were on the street. When there was no harvesting to be done, then you were on the street. There was no social security. There was no welfare. One begged, or borrowed, or stole. The young were illiterate, unable to write, unable to count, unable to manipulate figures so that they could not be employed in the emerging businesses. This was the end of the Dark Ages. Dark Ages were dark in Europe. Violence. Lack of any order. There was still corporal punishment in the home. There was still violence in the community. There was no common decency about dress or eating or hygiene. These things were unheard of. Thieves were branded on the forearm if their arms were not cut off, like with the V voleur. The life expectancy for women was around 30 or 31. Just a little bit higher for men because they weren't dying in childbirth, but it was low because of wars and accidents. Deaths and funerals was the background to daily life. Think of Les Miserables. Stress on parents and on family life. Often there was one parent. The father was absent because the father was off at war, or the father was harvesting in northern France or southern France, or was off on a ship fishing. The parents were themselves illiterate and unchurched. Famine and disease riddled the family. Most lived in a single room for which they paid rent. The family bed, the parents slept at the top. The children, many of them, slept at the bottom. In 17th century France, the word for closeness was promiscuité. There was no running water. There were no toilets indoors. There were chamber pots and dung heaps. Parents unable to bring up their children. And there was religious illiteracy. This is post-Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent's biggest concern was to reintroduce religious literacy to the great masses. So how to reach all Catholics with the mysteries of religion, therefore with some personal and social morality, because society and church were so closely aligned that to be good people helped to be able to see that there was a personal morality. So the church was trying to do this at the time, as well as religious practices. Parishes and catechisms were striving to do this, but how do you get people to attend when they're so busy with everything else, when church makes no meaning to them, and to make it more than just a Sunday event? Institutions unable to address these things. They were ill-equipped to deal with these emerging realities. Governments were focused on self-preservation, right? Kingdoms wanted to stay kingdoms. They were also focused on self-defense from other sovereignties. France didn't want to be overrun by Spain. The church was focused on fighting the after effects of Protestantism and the rising heresies in France like Jansenism and Gallicanism. And we'll talk about education more in a second. Give me a quick scan of our context in terms of these factors. Classism. Yeah. Right? The diminishing middle class, right? The great haves of the billionaires were arguing about what their tax level should be, and then everybody else. How about this next one? How about going to one of your malls on a Friday night? How about going on the streets of the large cities during the day with young black and Hispanic men? Dropouts from high school. You heard what Ospino said. New York City is some huge dropout rate. The completion rate for their minority kids is like 40%. And that's only taking account those who were initially counted in the system. Huge. How about the next? Lack of civility and personal morality with young people. Is that a reality? Does anybody hold the door anymore? Does anybody get up from sitting on the bus for the old woman who's barely able to, or do the kids push her out of the way? Not even. No. I don't want to caricature the whole thing, but I mean, I'm looking at if we did a quick cultural scan here. How about the next? The stresses that families are facing, single-parent family. I mean, that's 17th century France. Is that now? How about religious illiteracy? Lack of personal morality. Studies tell us that, but you're right in there. I know with our freshman classes, we had to teach them the sign of the cross. You never had to do that in the past, right? How about institutions unable to deal with the emerging needs? Is government doing it? Are our parishes doing it? Our parishes are dropping youth programs, aren't they? Because they're too costly? As we go through this, I don't want you to have the scan of 17th century France. I want you to keep in mind the scan of 21st century United States of America, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Providence, New York, wherever you happen to be. Think of the scan of your place. Okay, now let's look at the educational institutions. Now, if you were wealthy in 17th century France, you had a tutor. John Baptist de La Salle had a tutor. And then he also could go to a convent school or religious order school, like Benedictine or Jesuit or some of the sisters' orders, like the Madams of the, that type of a school. The Holy Child Sisters, the convent schools, the finishing schools. But if you didn't and you had a little bit of money, you went to these things called little schools. Little schools were called little schools because they were little. Handful of kids. in one room. I don't know if you can see the pictures, but at least you can see one. Look at those pictures. Both of them are paintings by von Ostad. What are some of the things you see there in this educational system? Yep. Different age groups, yep. Oh, yes, because why? How about that room on the left? I don't know if you could see this little kid up over there. Well, right? That could be a like a barn. Right? Three French educational historians, Chartier, Compère, and Julia, described the little schools like this: apparent disorder, individual method, recourse to physical punishment. You don't see it here, but he has the little stick to slap the kid if they don't know the lesson. Now, that's not unusual because there's violence in the society. Kids were hit in college if they didn't do their lessons. Mixture of ages. There's a lack of organization of the space. Look here. One-to-one, no group, no teacher-group relationship. Surprise sanctions. Why would they be surprise sanctions? Because these were not very well-trained teachers, and they could be having a bad day because they may have had to teach in one town on one day and then go to the next town, and their barn is not, because they were schools in barns, especially in the winter because the cattle would provide the heat for the school. Or it could be in the courtroom with the curtain drawn as the court case is being held. I mean, this is the honor given to the space. Risk of partiality on the part of the teacher, because if the parent is paying, greasing the palm, certainly the more money that you get, the more time you spend with Johnny or Jane. And there's a non-existent thing of a class. There's no class there. So that's the context. Now we could think of the context of our own school systems. Read Jonathan Kozol as he talks about urban public schools with peeling paint and rats in the cafeteria and kids who are being scripted to learn. The teachers actually have to have a script which they read through. Read Jonathan Kozol to get an idea of the context of American schooling, especially for the poor. So then now we come to the texts. Well, John Baptist de La Salle is a prolific writer of books. That's one of the blessings for us as LaSallians because we have plenty of stuff to look at. 1694 to 1706, he writes some 23 books. Principal ones are printed between 1701 and 1703. Most of them used other sources. So he drew and borrowed from other people, like any good teacher does, right? I say to my good teachers, never leave a ditto in a faculty room untouched. Right? Take it. You never know when you might need it. Same thing for him, right? Look at the sources. Look at the sources. His creativity, though, was to gather those correct sources for the young people that he was dealing with. Gathered the sources for the population that he was dealing with. Right? So he did not sit down and write the textbook, which therefore the teachers taught to the kids. No, he looked at the kids, found the resources, created the content and methodology. That's key. That's a key idea. That's what Huffman was saying. Right? We build from the individual student. So he has all of these books, which are all available through the national offerts. Principle 1, which we're going to deal with today, is called The Conduct of Schools. This was written not by him, But he took together all of the principal brothers. Each summer they would come together and they said, what works? And they took all of the what works, best practices, and they created the conduct of schools. A reflection on best practices that works with the kids who are sitting in front of them. And then he had the rules of Christian decorum and civility. He looked at his kids and said, how are these kids ever going to move from where they are to a higher social level? He said, well, they have to know decorum and civility. So he writes a book for commoners on how to act like nobility. Simple, step by step, everything from how to hold a spoon to how to blow your nose to how to meet somebody eye to eye. Everything, every jot and tittle. Yeah. But he did this not because he wanted to write a book on manners so that you have the great medieval noblesse oblige. No, he did it because of his theological anthropology, which Hofsman said the same thing. Each person is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Rich or poor, each young person is a temple of the Holy Spirit, a tabernacle. And that tabernacle needs to be treated with decorum, personally, and in dealing with other people, we have to deal with them civilly because they too are a temple of the Holy Spirit. They are a tabernacle. They are a reflection of the presence of God. That drives this book because he's looking at these young people. The duties of the Christian to God, his catechetical text, which he takes like the 10 basic things that young people, he believes young people have to know in terms of personal morality and religious practice, and writes them in such a way that, first of all, the teachers can understand, but then the kids can understand, and there's also a guide to liturgical practice. So this is a big 3-volume book. And then he writes religious instructions and exercises. He writes hymns. He writes religious hymns. He writes the words, though. He doesn't write the music. What does he use for music? Yeah, popular melodies. So the kids know the melodies, and he writes the religious words. Right? He's looking at the kids' cultural context, right? How to prepare for confession. All sorts of little things that the teacher would have to know, and how do you get the kids engaged in religious practice. Then he writes the meditations. These are gospel reflections for his early brothers. He writes them for the time of retreat. 16 days during September when the kids are off harvesting, the brothers are in retreating. He writes them for Sundays and feasts. And in these things, he ties ministry and spirituality. These are his most creative gift. What he's doing is he's giving voice to his double contemplation. He's taking the mysteries of the gospel and reading them in light of the lived experience of himself and his brothers. Wonderful, wonderful documents. And he writes other books. These texts are not theoretical documents, right? These texts are reflections on reality. Hopefully, that's how we look at our texts. That we look at our texts as reflections on reality that can open the door to young people. And that we're not slavishly attentive to the text for the sake of the text. That's not what John Baptist de La Salle is saying. So when I'm going to be talking about texts all the way through here, I want you to think about what are the principles of content and methodology that emerge from the young people whom you're teaching. That becomes the text that you're teaching. The text is their experiences. Very, very different than the way that we conceive of education now, right? The text, somebody says, well, what's your syllabus? And say, okay, here's my syllabus, and they hand a textbook. That's no syllabus. That's a cheap way out. That's not attentive to the kids at all. It's a tool. That's the tool. The syllabus is what's the lived experience of the young people with the lived experience of what I am teaching, and as Pakapama says, how do I weave the experience of the subject, the experience of the student, and my own experience as teacher together in this seamless, woven fabric. That's education. Weaving my person with the person of the student, my context, the context of the student, with this body of knowledge that I love, poetry. And how do I make that become a seamless garment for a community of learners in school? Pakapama, courage to teach. That's what I'm talking about in terms of text, drawn from the lived experience. Okay, well, we're going to look at, in particular, the conduct of the school, conduite des écoles chrétiennes. The foremost researcher is Brother Léon Laurier, an older man from France. I'm borrowing a lot of stuff from him. So, we have to remember right from the very beginning that this is for primary school teachers, a basic education, entirely staffed by brothers. Now, for us in the room, none of those three conditions hold. But if you would think about if you went into in a city and you had a group of young kids, like in pre-primary, pre-kindergarten, and you were doing something with some young Mexican-American adults who are not completely trained, this would be the type of text that you would want here. However, Laurier says, and this is our challenge this morning, let's read below the text. Let's read behind the words. Let's look at the orientations. And I agree with him that there are astonishing insights of wisdom here. And as I said before, it was for a guide for teachers. Remember, he's pulling these people off the street. They haven't gone and got their BAs. They haven't done their student teaching. Right? He pulls them off the street. He puts them in the novitiate for a year. And in the novitiate, they're learning spiritual stuff and they're learning pedagogical stuff. And then he's putting them into a classroom of 85. Now, he's providing guides for them, monitors for them, and he's providing this thing which they memorize. They're memorizing this because this is their salvation. What do? I do this. 85.
Pretty typical at this time in the
No, there isn't any.
No, I'm sorry, with the brothers, wherever they were, 85 is pretty
Well, in the origins, yeah. When I went to Catholic elementary school, I had 65 in my first grade. We sat double in a seat. When I started teaching at St. Eddie, how many did you have in the fourth grade? 42? I think I had 46 or 47. Yeah. So, I mean, that's not all unusual. And they were seated somewhat like this, and I'll explain that in a bit. So, I mean, they had these large numbers of kids because the crying need was, I can't just deal with these kids one by one. There are hundreds of kids who need to be educated. So how are we going to do it? So the purpose of the conduct. All of that being said about a guide for teachers, the purpose of the conduct is the creation of a school that's student-centered. When you cut through everything, it's the creation of a school that's student-centered. So if we look at the needs, think of this in terms of the context. They have economic needs, family and affective needs, social and relational. They don't know how to relate to the wealthy. The only thing that they know is to pickpocket. Educational and intellectual needs, right? They're illiterate. Religious and spiritual needs. They're unchurched. Those are the needs of kids. So therefore, this is the purpose of the conduct. An education of the body. That's what that civility is, right? Because how are you going to deal with family and affective and social and educational if they're not learning how to present themselves. You have to. There's no way you're going to move in the social class, right? I'm thinking of a story of a young man, African-American, senior, was selected to receive a prestigious award at a banquet. During the day, he comes to the person who's bringing him and says, "I can't go." And the guy says, "Why can't you go?" He says, "I'm afraid." So what are you afraid of? He's a big football player. "I don't know how to use the knives and the spoons." Right? Education of the body. You've got to think of that. That's part of the lived reality of those. That's part of the lived reality of kids now, too. Right? Go to an interview with your hat on. You think somebody's going to even pay attention to you? Go with all your body piercings. I mean, these are the things that we have to think of. And kids have to learn. Right? I'm going to dress differently if I'm here, if I'm going to see the Pope or the President. Right? Am I pandering up to them? No. It's appropriate. There's certain appropriate norms which young people have to learn. That's what he's trying to do. Schooling, obviously, the educational, the reading, the writing, the arithmetic. Socio-relational formation. How do I deal with other people? He creates community in his classroom. Every kid in the class has a job. Cleaning the classroom, stoking the fire. One opens the school in the beginning of the day. One rings the bell for prayer. Another collects the food at breakfast to serve to the other kids. They all have jobs. They all have a significant part. They form a community. They are brothers to each other. They are helpers to each other. There's a moral and ethical education that goes on here. How they deal with each other. There's never any bullying. Not tolerated. Never any fighting. Not tolerated. And then a Christian formation, which we'll talk a lot more about. The solutions offered respond to the needs. Not like what we do now, right? Common Core standards. Right? Common Core standards are created by a group of experts who then say, everybody has to know the Common Core standard. It's the exact opposite. Instead of saying, what are the needs of kids, and then developing what the Common Core standards are, the experts are saying, from our perspective, these are what the Common Core standards would be, and now you have to fit your education in. The bishop standards, the same thing. Right? Done from on high, not from below. The purpose is to lay the foundation for future employment. Now, we would have to say, what would be our purpose? Well, maybe our purpose is to prepare our young people to be citizens of the 21st century and all that that implies. So let's think about that as being the purpose of our Lasallian school. Right? But for this Lasallian school of the 17th century, it was, well, vocational training was needed. Obviously, they didn't have jobs. The craft guilds themselves trained the kids. So kids never remained in school after 14, 15, or 16 because that's when the crafts guilds started to take the kids over. So De La Salle had kids between 6 and 12 or 13. Most likely he only had them for 2 years. So you have to think about this. He only had them for a 2-year period to prepare them for what they were going to do with the crafts. But not just the crafts. They obviously aren't going to the colleges and universities. That's reserved for the ruling class. But there's a new economy emerging, and he sees this. Manufacturing, factories, commercial enterprises. So there was needing of manual skills and school subjects that would be accessible to the children of the lower class. That's what he does. That's the Christian school. So let's not pretend, right, that LaSalle's sole purpose was that kids get into heaven. Part of LaSalle's purpose is that young people have the fullness of life. Because unless you have an experience of the fullness of life, how can you even believe that there is a heaven? Unless you're hoodwinked into it. As Marx says, the great masses had been hoodwinked into. So the characteristics of the curriculum, we're going to run through these quickly, and then I'm going to spend a little time on each. Again, I want you to think of these not in terms of 17th century France. I'll give you an example from 17th century, but think, what does this mean now for me? Useful and practical, vocational, high quality. I hope we say our schools are of high quality. There's nothing worse than giving poor quality to poor kids and raising their expectations and giving them nothing. That's awful. That's a social sin. Sometimes we do it. We're sloppy. We think if we give them anything, it's better than nothing. Solid and lasting. He only had them for 2 years. He didn't have a chance to come back and recapitulate when they were seniors. Checked and assessed, that constant assessment that Haspino talked about. How do we assess? Based on where we want to go, and then suited to the individual. Let's look at these in terms of the competencies that he talked about. First of all, an intentionality. Right? If anything, these schools, this curriculum was intentional. Right? It was based on the needs of young people. So, as he said, we have to be intentional in what we do. There also has to be formation, which can be divided into content, method, structures, and continuous assessment. That's what we're talking about here. And finally, it has to be conversion. These people had to let go of the only model that they knew. The only model that they knew was the tutor, the little school, the convent school. And De La Salle is saying, throw out that model, throw out those models, they don't work, here's a new model. That's conversion. Put your money where your mouth is on that. And he was challenged, because his brother said to him, sure, you have money, De La Salle, if this doesn't work, you can go back to your family's wealth. And he called their bluff eventually. During the famine, he took all of his money and he bought bread and gave it to the people who were starving. And then the next year, the brother said to him, why'd you give away all your money? You could have provided foundational money for the schools. But he was converted. This is God's will. This is God's design. Okay, so the characteristics. Useful and practical to help students learn. A big thing was deciphering manuscripts. So, in the spelling section of the conduct, it says, the manner of teaching them to spell, not a spelling bee, right? The manner of teaching them to spell will be to have them copy letters written by hand, actual documents. Right? Now think about this in terms of our own kids. What do we want that's useful and practical? Maybe think like technology. Right? Think. Right? They will copy especially such things as it might be useful for them to know how to write, and of which they might later have need, such as notes of hands, receipts, agreements with workers, legal contracts, bonds, powers of attorney, leases, deeds, and official reports. He's preparing them to be legal assistants, business assistants. This is done so that they may impress these things on their memories and learn to write similar ones. Useful and practical. What for our people to prepare them to be citizens of the 21st century is useful and practical? Knowledge of a global world, critical thinking. I mean, I think we could go through a whole listing of things, right? What is useful and practical? What's vocational? What's going to give them some skills? Here it was utilitarian, not cultural or intended to provide a body of theoretical knowledge. It might be different for us, right? We do want to be cultural. We do want to be multicultural. So let's not slavishly take this, but let's look at the example. Strong and optimistic viewpoint regarding the value of education. He had to convince parents, right, that in the long run, their kids are going to be better off going to school learning to read and write than harvesting and bringing in the money right now. Think about our own parents and their demands that every kid go to Harvard and Yale. It's likely the parents didn't fully appreciate all of the characteristics of the Lasallian education here. This really stretched the teachers, because these teachers barely knew how to write and to spell and to do mathematics. You got to teach them to read. What's the type of vocational training we're engaged in with our kids? What prepares? What are the jobs? What are the jobs of 2020, of 2025? Of high quality. They had to repeat over and over again until their work is perfect. Why? They will never be able to read well, and the teachers who will later be in charge of them will have great difficulty. Do well what you're doing now, because you only have them now. So what does high quality mean for us? What do we conceive of high quality? Our college admittance statistics? Our kids as graduates involved in volunteer work? How are we judging high quality? Based on a goal, young people to be meaningful, productive citizens of the 21st century, citizens of the world, citizens of the United States, members of a church. Solid and lasting, much like we said before, has to be known thoroughly for it to be grounded and lasting. Not by rote. What do I have to learn for this test? I only want to study what is going to be on the test. Don't we hear that all the time? This is saying no. No, it has solid learning, lasting learning, critical learning, learning that taps into the experience of young people so that they say that this makes sense to me. Not what do I have to learn for the test, which then they forget the next day, and then the teacher has to keep on reminding them all the way. No, how do we create curriculum which is solid and lasting? That's what he's saying here. Checked and assessed. There are monthly assessments. The teacher assessed. The inspector of school checked. The pupil stayed in place, moved on, started over. There was a fluidity to the system. And we'll talk a bit more about this. It was a double safety check for pupils and parents. It's written in the conduct. Listen to this. Can you imagine if a principal said this to teachers? If it happens that parents complain that their children are learning nothing or very little, and say that they want to take their children away because of this, the following measures should be taken to avoid this undesirable outcome. Because he believes that the focus of salvation is in the school. So you've got to have the kids there. No teacher unable to teach writing should be put into a class where pupils learn writing. 2, steps should be taken not to put or leave in any school teachers who are incapable of fulfilling their duties properly or teaching well the children entrusted to their care. Where is the locus of responsibility? On the kid or on the teacher? On the teacher. De La Salle spends a huge amount of time talking about how to get the kids into the school, how to address absenteeism, because he believes they have to be there. Once they're there, something magical will happen. For those 90% of the Hispanics who go to a Catholic school, once they're there, something magical will happen. But how do you get them there? And he's saying, if there are adults who are standing in the way, get rid of the adults. This is a student-centered school, not a teacher-centered school. That our schedule revolves around the whims of our teachers. And finally, suited to the individual. Students come into the school and they're interviewed and they're assessed. This is back then, right? Abilities evaluated so they're put into the appropriate group. So these are all groups here. Each one of these rows is a group. And, okay, well, you belong in this group. So you're going to start off over here. Relatively homogeneous age and level. He didn't want to put older kids with younger kids. Innovation in private education, primary education at that time. So we say that he's the founder of simultaneous instruction. He really is the founder of differentiated instruction, of mastery learning, right? Because he's differentiating for an entire group. Within a large group of 85, he's differentiating for groups within. Each group is divided into lessons or audits, like subsections. And then the progress is evaluated each month as each student moves through each subsection, so that there is a guarantee that as they move through the rows, they are learning.
Is it almost like there's different class levels?
In the same class.
In the same room?
Yeah, because his biggest school was 2 classrooms.
Okay.
So you would have multiple levels in the same classroom, but then he would divide off. So kids, and there was always a door between the two, so that the kid could move from one classroom to the other. There was a certain amount of flexibility. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And the material was divided step by step. Incremental steps, the way that we all learn, right? Start at the beginning, we move through little by little by little by little. This is a student record that the teacher would have kept. Does this teacher know the kid? He has 85. Does he know the kid? Oh, yeah. Because they've been meeting with parents, too. He knows the kid. He knows the kid in the context. Student-centered. Student-centered. The kid is not just a name. He knows the kid. Okay, let's look at the schedule for the week. We're going to quickly go through this. We don't really have a schedule, but if you read the conduct sort of unrolls this from the beginning to the end. You can see there's large chunks of catechism and reading and writing. The important thing is this looks very rigid, but don't our schedules with things dropping out and whatever, don't that look rigid? But then we have the snow day, we have the walkathon, we have the pep rally, we have the this. Well, they had the same things. They had the religious procession, they had the guild fair, they had bad weather, they had whatever. So it's not quite as rigid as it may seem. However, look at the amount of time that the teacher spends. 6 days, very few holidays except a few at Easter, the month of September. So the teacher was with the student 46 or 47 weeks of the year, approximately 280 days, and about 40 hours per week with the same kids. That's how to get to know them. And that's because he only has them for 2 years. Not for the convenience for the teacher, for the sake of the kid. Which is why the brothers suffered from fatigue, overwork, illness, and he had to make adjustments for that. So he would appoint 3 brothers for a school of 2. So there would always be somebody who could come in immediately to do it. And all this is to create that relational quality. The course curriculum is reading in French, not in Latin. Back in that time, they learned in Latin. Well, until LaSalle said, this doesn't make any sense. They don't speak Latin. How are they going to read Latin? So he says, we're going to learn to read in French. But they did learn Latin for the sake of pronunciation and so that they can participate in church services. And they learned writing. Now, he didn't start teaching writing until the kid was 10 years old. Why? Why? Fine motor skills. The younger kid wouldn't have the fine motor skills required to do the manuscript writing that he was demanding there. But if the kid came into school late, they started writing by the time they were 12 years old because he said writing was so important that they have to know this. Why was writing important? Because it opened the door to them. It opened the door to some sciences, to geometrical drawing, for example, building trade and architecture, so like blueprinting, for spelling and grammar, the copying of texts, like we saw before, brings them into contact with professional people out of their normal sphere, and it introduces them to religious concepts because they often wrote from religious texts. Arithmetic, but it was based on coinage. They had to know how to write to do arithmetic. Why? Because all of the computations that they were doing involved coinage and problems. You know, if you 2 lira for this, 4 lira for this, how many lira do you get back? I mean, so it was for merchants and craftsmen. That was the type, not algebra. And then spelling, the actual writing. And the spelling was either done by copying perfectly the model or by a dictation. Oh, that's cruel. When I was a freshman in high school, Brother Amy and Paul, who still teaches at LaSalle Academy and teaches AP English, taught me freshman English. And every night, 7 days a week, we copied an editorial from the newspaper. We wrote it out. And then we wrote a 250-word response. And he read 1 per week. And if we had a 10-day vacation, we did 10, and he read 1. I never had a problem writing after it. Why? It's this. I learned editorial style, crisp writing, by modeling. And then there was the simultaneous teaching, which I said really is differentiated. They're sitting on the long benches just like you're here. They're in range of orders of progress. So we have the beginners, the average, and the advanced because of where they're sitting, you know, like the bluebirds, you know, right? Because of where they're sitting. So you're starting here, say the alphabet. Well, this group, you're just getting the sounds, and now you're matching the sounds with the letters, and you're starting to do some of the diphthongs, putting the things together. As they progressed, they moved. But they were conscious of it. So you're moving. So today you're there, but tomorrow you're here. So you know, boy, I made some advancement. Don't kids love that? To see that they're actually making progress? So they're moving. So they're seeing that they improved. Check this out, though. Can you imagine presenting this to a parent? Right? You just get to the end of the row. The teacher says, this row needs the help that you can give. Would you be willing to stay at this row and not go up there for the sake of your brothers who are sitting here? It's cooperative learning, right? That's the creation of a community of learners. I am responsible for my brother or sister in this learning enterprise, right? I'm not griming for the grade. And the method is like a coach. Wonderful model. How do we teach free throw shooting? As the coach, we stand there. Stand next to me. See how my hands are going? Then I stand behind. Okay, your elbow is off. Pull your elbow in. Let's do this 20 times. All of the education here was an education built on modeling. So you put before students the pronunciation, the articulation, the writing. Student imitates with the help of other students, if necessary with the teacher. You keep on doing it over and over again, and you build a habit, like a free throw shot. You do it enough, you do it well. And then regular questioning and review. This is important because the notion of modeling will hold. I'm going to move now into the catechism. The modeling, though, is now the model based on the virtue of the teacher. It's the same thing. The model based on the virtue of the teacher becomes the model of Christian living for the young person sitting in the class, which says something about the tremendous role and responsibility that we have as teachers. Not just religious studies, which provides us with a great opportunity, or campus ministers, but all. Because we become the model of Christian living. So, the place of the catechism. Well, Some people would say, oh my God, in the conduct, only 7 pages of 187 are about the catechism. That's true. We looked at that schedule, only 30 minutes of 7.5 hours of a day, a catechism. That's true. But the teaching catechism is critical. It's critical to the salvation of students because De La Salle has a coherent and integrated pastoral plan. His pedagogical scheme is twofold: to instruct children in the fundamental truths. Those of you who are theology, religious study teachers, there's yours. But second of all, to apprentice them in the living faith, to create the psychological and spiritual climate wherein apprenticeship becomes Christian initiation. The model of the apprenticeship into the guild is the model that he's using here. Apprentice young people into Christian initiation. And that's campus ministry. Right? There's your pastoral component. The child is called upon day after day to practice what he's learning about a Christian. Last night in prayer, I don't know if you saw the little quote here. The school is the novitiate of Christianity. The school is the place where Christianity is born. Very key component here. That's why I questioned Dr. Ospino about religious education programs. De La Salle was insistent. He founded schools where catechism was taught. Not catechetical centers that also happened to teach reading, writing, arithmetic. It was an integrated approach. He was adamant that the Lasallian ministry was an apostolic ministry, and the place for this ministry was the school. The school was a sacred place. The school was a place for the education of the whole child. The fullness of life that was going to happen is going to happen within the school. Now, even though there's only a half hour out of 7.5 and 7 pages, the conduct offers a total religious saturation spread throughout the day. So the classrooms were sparsely decorated, but there was a crucifix, pictures of Jesus, Mary, and the Holy Family, and gospel axioms. Love one another. That's what the students learned to read. Their physical context was surrounded by a spiritual framework. Nothing to distract. How about our own classrooms? A lot of high school classrooms look like you're walking into the desert. There's a void. There's a bare crucifix at the front and nothing else. You don't see student work. You don't see nothing that engages students visually. Religious gestures. The students, when they came in, did the holy water and the sign of the cross. They bowed to the crucifix. They knelt at their place for prayer. Before you people came in this morning, I came in here, and I knelt, and I kissed the desk. That's what the teachers did back then. Because it's an acknowledgement that this is holy ground. This is the presence of God. If I'm going to meet God anywhere this morning, I'm meeting God right here. And this is holy ground. And that's what the kids learned, that their educational space was holy ground. And postures and moments of recollection. Every half hour, the student rang the bell to remember the presence of God, interrupting the teacher. We have enough trouble having the teacher say the prayer at the beginning of class, never mind interrupting. Oh, I can't be interrupted for 30 seconds. No. The students would answer questions by their hands folded like this because they were in a special place. It was an honorable place. Their reading materials were the Psalter, Christian instruction. Their writing lessons were based on models from Scripture, gospel maxims, the fathers of the church. Their spelling lessons put into writing what they remembered from the catechism lesson of the week. A hotbed, a hothouse of Christian living. That's what he's creating for them. They're not going to find it elsewhere. The school is providing this hothouse where people can be safe, where they can feel safe being moral, where they can feel safe being nonviolent, where they can feel safe being a brother to each other, where they can feel safe thinking about a God who might love them. Tremendous amount of time is spent in chapter 7 of the conduct on prayer and interiority. So the students prayed the rosary when they got to the church. They went to the local church. For Mass, well, they prayed the rosary there. Kids carried the box of rosaries so that when then the rosary distributor distributed the rosaries. And then it was morning prayer. And there was that constant half-hour remembrance of God's presence. And before every lesson, there was a special prayer. Lord, make me attentive. There was a prayer at the meals, because they did serve breakfast together. There was an afternoon and evening prayer. There was the morning meditation that Brother Ernest spoke about, which often the student read the meditation, but the teacher, one of the 3 moments where the teacher spoke from his heart, reflected on the meditation. The evening examen of conscience at the end of the day, a reflection on how was this day. The student read it, asked some reflective questions like, did I poke my buddy? And then the teacher would reflect on, well, let's look at the course of the day. What did we learn? It's the context, that everything is done within the context of prayer. And then the special prayers. You know, they're carrying the Eucharist to the sick, so somebody is outside ringing the bell. Class stops, and they say the special prayer as the Eucharist is moving by. You know, the lost dot, like a hearse goes by. We used to stop on the street as kids. We'd stop and we'd take our hats off and we'd bow our heads and pray for the... Now, does that happen? No. There was this whole context of that my life is a spiritual journey for these kids. And interiority. Now, these kids live in a one-room house. Do they have interiority? Do they have silence? No, not in their household, not on the streets. Silence is key. Why? Well, you have 85 kids in a class. You need silence for order, number one. You need silence for respect, for social order, that I respect the space of another. I'll let somebody have the space to think and study. Right? Not silence for the sake of silence, but silence for the sake of the purpose. Silence as a spiritual, ascetical practice. How do I quiet myself to hear the God who speaks to me? Do kids need silence today? Yeah, they're plugged in. We're plugged in. First thing we do when we go into the car, we turn the radio on. We go into our room, we turn on the TV. Right? We're afraid of silence because God speaks in the whispers. Right? And for the young person, then and now, to create that space for silence, they're in God's presence. I can't stand it when the teacher says, let us remember that we're in the holy presence of God. St. John Baptist, tell us how to pray. How can we remember that we're in the holy presence of God if we're rushing right through the... Why not say, let us remember that we're in the holy presence of God and count to 10. Is 10 seconds going to kill our lesson? The kids just probably run from phys ed. They're sweating. They don't even know what class they're running. How about remembering that we're in God's presence? Silence, interiority. And silence is a part of correction. I could spend a whole lecture on correction conversion. For De La Salle, correction is for the conversion of the young person's behavior. And that only happens when the young person has the quiet time to think about what he did, the motivations, and to change the behavior over time. Silence plays a key role in correcting. And you know, if you've ever corrected kids in the heat of the battle, you've lost. You correct out of love. You correct out of what's going to help the kid, not what's going to make you feel better at the moment. Silence for the teacher, silence for the student. And the student should say, I'm happy because of it. Key to this, though, is what I said before, the modeling. The evangelization of the heart is dependent on the student-teacher relationship. You alone can truly touch and convert a heart, God. And ask God often for the grace to touch hearts as he does. Touching hearts and winning hearts is mentioned 35 times in De La Salle's writing. It's a dynamic concept. It's not fluff, like the Valentine's Day heart and the little arrow. It's not that. It's the touching of heart to promote motion, to generate change. Brother Jacques Goussin writes, to touch can mean to pierce, toucher. as in fencing. And the heart is that which is most intimate, most profound, most personal in the person, where the will is concerned, the intention, the resolution, the transition to action. So the touching of heart is not an affective, sentimental activity. It's a morally charged activity to reach another person in order that that person move to action. That's the miracle that we're called to perform. And, as De La Salle says, that God requires of us. Let me read a little personal letter I received a couple of years ago. Dear Brother Fred, as my incredible 6-year journey comes to a close, I've been reflecting on the amazing experience La Salle Academy has provided for me. For example, I was afforded the opportunity to learn from the best faculty available and build relationships with people that will carry for the rest of my life. I was able to participate in competitive athletic teams and clubs that were as close as my own family. Thanks greatly in part to those experiences, as well as to people like you. Every single day for the past 6 years, when I pulled up at the spotlight at Dunkin' Donuts across the street, turned left onto Academy Avenue, a smile came across my face, for I knew I was home again. There are very few things in life that are a constant. Such things are unwavering and can always be counted on. It's always important to have things like this in one's life, and for me, it was your gentle presence and firm handshake in the hallways between classes. I don't teach. In the middle of a stressful day, you're always there to remind me indirectly that I must slow down, respect the little things, and not take life for granted. Whether you know it or not, you've been a role model and an idol to me over the past 4 years. The compassion and unconditional kindness which you showed toward each and every student is admirable, and the dedication you demonstrate to each and every athletic team is incredible. Your steadfast support for everything to do with La Salle is one of the many reasons why it's such an amazing place. You've taught me many lessons over the past 4 years, but these are not the lessons that can be learned in the classroom. They are life lessons that I have learned simply by observing the way you go about your life. The cards that you take time to send to so many students go a long way, and perhaps farther even than you can perhaps imagine. I have every single card that you've ever sent to me, and they're coming with me to college as a gentle reminder of where I've come from and the lifelong relationships I built along the way. Most importantly, however, it will always remind me, and this is he's quoting the last card, that even when the wind is against us, we must continue to sail on, not drifting, not at anchor, but moving on. Thank you for the memories, brother, and for the lasting impact you've had on my life. Love always. God bless. I don't teach, but in order to touch hearts, we have to build a strong human student-pupil relationship. Absolutely essential, no way around it. And in the touching of the heart, our heart is touched. It's a relationship. And I'm not accumulating the touching of hearts and putting them on my refrigerator. Heart 1, heart 2, look at me. I have more hearts than you have. No, because the intentionality is in touching the heart, we're drawing the young person to God. Our love opens the love of God. Miguel Campos and Michelle Savage, in announcing the good news to the poor, have a magnificent passage referring to the teacher as the sacrament of God's presence. For these young people, 17th century France, who could not know God's love, there was no way in their experience. Not knowing what love was, how could they know God's love? When their teachers loved them, they opened the gospel. They opened the mystery of the Eucharist, the real presence. It's the same for us. We open the hearts of young people to the love of God and the experience of God's love by our own love. Real, human love. That opens them. You know it. You know the kids are starving for it. We're doing it not so that we feel better, but we're doing it so that they can develop a relationship to the God who loves them. What does a religion class look like? There's some great suggestions here. So read these in light of your own, the way that you deal with things. You might have to read it off the page. Before the lesson starts, they start with some verses of a hymn. Why do they do that? Why would you do that? They were familiar with it. Kids like to sing. It's motivational. I know the religion teacher who teaches across from me. Every class starts with this song. And on Friday afternoons, the kids are singing these songs, freshmen and sophomores, they love it. There's something about music, which it's a way of engaging immediately, of flipping the switch, of getting kids into this new context. And then they do a special prayer. God, help me to listen to the catechism lesson attentively for the love of you, not for the grade. Then there's a quick review, questioning. I'm not going to have a lot of time to spend time on how the questioning happens, but this is not scripted learning. Now, this is the teacher, the one point of the day where the teacher is directly talking to the full group of students. They're all working together now in the large group, and he's asking the questions rapidly, small questions that are understandable so that they can come to the knowledge of the truth. Sub-questions, drilling and memorization essential, but only when it's clear that the text is understood. The teacher is looking for knowledge, not that they can repeat back, why did God make you? God made me to know, love, and serve this. No, to have a sense of what it was. So they have to be able to say it in their own words. Then, as we just talked about, the suppletion method was to be understood as the touching of hearts. The catechism, particularly the catechism lesson on Sunday, the teacher for 90 minutes spoke the personal reflection on the Sunday readings, the great mysteries the teacher spoke to, which is the third time that the teacher would speak directly from the heart. Then at the end of the lesson, there would be that quick dialogue. What did you learn from the lesson? What are you going to take with you? Reflect on the day. What did this lesson say to you about the day? A nice bridging. And then they're sent off in twos into the neighborhood singing a song. Now, why would you do that? Yeah, because you're remembering the lesson. The last thing you're doing is you're going up singing about God loves me, whatever it is that you happen to be singing. You think these are little kids, but big kids do the same thing. Right? What you leave them with at the end is what they're going to remember. The method I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. You can see these. It's a matter of questioning, short, complete, accurate, accommodating those who struggle, always simpler questions, having people help them, suited to the capacity of the average student. You're not working off your brightest kid. The teacher models that this is serious. We're told, the teacher is told, the teacher will be careful never to speak in a dull way which could produce weariness. Right? So you've got to be on your game in this religion class. No punishment. No punishment. If the kid is misbehaving, you don't correct at that time. You wait until the next day. Because that would be a counter message to the God who loves and desires that all come to the full freedom. And then there was a focus on the positive, encouraging, lending assistance, engaging students, making class enjoyable, rewards not for the best student, but for the best behaved, the most attentive, and the greatest effort. And they got the holy cards, or they got the little statues, or they got whatever they were going to get. Students' behavior, formal, respectful, answering complete sentences, moderate tone. This was important. This was significant, attentive at all times. No laughing at other people's mistakes. There was a certain order and method. And the brothers were held strongly to this. Why? If the brother is the instrument of the salvation of these young people and does his work poorly, he's standing in the way of God's salvation for these young people. And in the 15th and 16th meditation for the time of retreat, John Baptist de la Salle writes, when you die and you're at the great judgment, your pupils are going to be around you. And they are going to testify to the Lamb of how you led them to salvation. And what a great joy it will be. Now, he doesn't say, like the sheep and the goats. And if your students are there and testifying before the Lamb and say what a lousy guy you were and that you didn't lead them to salvation. But that's the implication. The young people will testify to you, for you before God, of how you assisted them in their salvation. That's why you had to be on your game. You had to be on your game here. No laxity. No faking it. No insincerity. You know, the kids could read crap right away. They could read it then, they could read it now. You're going to give them that? They're not going to believe that there's a God that loves them. It's a God who's faking them. Why did this work? This is why it worked then. Think about why it might work now. What is every educational report saying? Whether you're talking about Teach America or whatever, we have a lack of trained, competent teachers. It worked because he had trained, competent, committed teachers. Why did it work? Not one curriculum fits all. I create the curriculum, the methodology, the content, which best addresses the needs of kids. If we read educational literature, almost everything that's coming out now is talking about formative assessment within the classroom. Constant assessment of where the kids are. They're talking about endpoint assessment too, but they're talking about and that's what this is. This was formative assessment. It works because the kids knew that they were succeeding. Why did it work? Order and structure. Safe environment. Kids not bullied. Kids not afraid to make mistakes. Isn't that a condition of learning now? Go into a math class where you have kids who are math phobic, and the very first day, either the teacher yells at the kid because they didn't know the answer, or another kids laugh. That class becomes crippled for the rest of the time. Same thing with foreign language. Student is learner. Active engagement of the kid. Always engaged. They're not sitting there listening. They're working. They're reciting things. They're reading things. They're copying things. Constant engagement of the students. Not a 45-minute lecture. And then students, what we would call metacognition now. Right? Students' attention to how they learn, how they're learning. What are they developing? What's my learning style? How do I best learn? How do I best manipulate this data? How do I best study? Do I need to see things? Do I need to hear things? How do I do all of that? That's why it worked. That's what he did. So what does it all mean today? Let's flip from general context to religious education, campus ministry context. What's the context that we face today? What are some of those contextual things as we read our signs of the times for young people? Unchurched. What else? Stressed families. What else? Yep, civility. Yep. Secularism. Technology. Individualism. Right? Those are the big contexts, right, in which we have to situate our pedagogical practice, at least in terms of religious education and campus ministry. What are the texts that, what are the educational principles and curricular structures that we bring to this from our Lasallian heritage? Who's the key role? What's the key role in the classroom in learning? Who's the key actor? Student. The concern for the student, right? So our text, our educational principle has to be the central role of the student. But what else? Is it just the individual student? It's the community of learners? It's a Lasallian principle. A community of learners. So how are we concerned with the individual, and how do we situate the individual in a community? How about education for justice? How about development of a critical conscience? Those become the texts the principles. Brings us back to what we heard on Sunday night. To see the context, to judge through the text. The text is the judgment. It's the application of our best reflection on what's going to respond to the context. And then we do. And what are the great signs of the Institute of the Brothers of the Christian Schools? The spirit of faith, the spirit of zeal. The spirit of faith is to see with the eyes of God. To see as God sees. That's the spirit of faith. That's seeing, that's perspective. Wonderful meditation for the Feast of the Epiphany. The three kings, they go in. They see the child Jesus in the swaddling clothes. And the challenge that De La Salle provides. Do you see the poor kids in rags in your class? Do you see in them the person of Jesus? Do you see in the kid who gives you a dirty look every day the face of God? Do you see the kid who comes in smelling the face of God? Do you see the kid who has no friends the face of God? Do you see the star athlete who thinks he's elite the face of God? See with the eyes of faith. See as God sees. God doesn't see all of that stuff. God sees the temple of the Holy Spirit. The person made in the image and likeness of himself, herself. And then zeal. Because I see with the eyes of faith, I act with burning love. That's what zeal. I act with burning love. I can't hold back. Because I have seen and I have judged, and as De La Salle did, I have to act to be true to myself. I have to engage in zeal. And those LaSallians who do not have the faith, spirit of faith and the spirit of zeal are said to be dead branches who would be best cut off and sent to the fire. From the earliest rule that the brothers have. The challenge is great. Thank you.